Get out and stay out! My dad roared across the dining room, his face twisted with rage and disappointment. The Thanksgiving turkey sat untouched between us as his words echoed off the walls of our family home in San Diego. I sat there, stunned by the venom in his voice, my fork still halfway to my mouth. The cranberry sauce suddenly tasted bitter, and I felt the familiar weight of his expectations crushing down on me like a physical force. My name is Brielle Hampton. I'm 28 years old, and I had just shattered my father's carefully constructed dream for our family legacy. For as long as I could remember, Douglas Hampton had orchestrated every aspect of my life around one singular goal: joining the prestigious Hampton & Associates law firm that bore our family name. My brother Chase had fallen in line perfectly, graduating from Harvard Law and sliding seamlessly into his role as junior partner. But I'd always been different, always questioning, always drawn to something bigger than billable hours and corporate litigation. The moment I told my father I had officially withdrawn from law school, I watched 28 years of his investment in me crumble before his eyes. He had spent decades building Hampton & Associates into one of San Diego's most respected family law practices, and in his mind, I had just thrown it all away. My mother Janine sat frozen beside him, her wineglass trembling slightly in her manicured hands. She had perfected the art of silent agreement over the years, never challenging my father's vision for our family's future. "You're a disgrace to everything this family has built," Douglas continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his shouting. "I've sacrificed everything to give you opportunities, and this is how you repay me?" I set down my fork carefully, feeling something cold and determined settling in my chest. The disappointment wasn't new, but the finality in his voice was. Chase shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on his plate as if the mashed potatoes held the secrets of the universe. Even now, at 34 years old, he couldn't bring himself to defend me against our father's wrath. "After everything I've done for you," Douglas said, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Get out of my house. Get out and stay out." My mother's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room as I slowly stood up, tucking my napkin neatly beside my plate. The ritual of family dinner had become a performance we all participated in, but tonight, the curtain had finally fallen. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes on my back, but nobody called out to stop me. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. Growing up in the Hampton household meant living under the constant pressure of achievement and appearances. My father had built his reputation on the foundation of family values and legacy, ironically, while emotionally distancing himself from his own children. Chase had always been the golden child, the one who asked the right questions and made the right choices. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, passed the bar on his first attempt, and seamlessly transitioned into the family business, without ever questioning whether it was what he truly wanted. I, on the other hand, had always been the problematic daughter. While Chase studied corporate law and taxation, I found myself drawn to environmental science and social entrepreneurship. During my undergraduate years at UC San Diego, I spent my summers volunteering with sustainable development organizations instead of interning at prestigious law firms. My father tolerated these phases as long as I maintained my grades and stayed on track for law school. The tension between us had been building for years, but it reached a breaking point during my second year at Stanford Law. I was sitting in a contracts class, listening to a professor drone on about breach remedies, when I realized I was slowly dying inside. Every case study felt like another nail in the coffin of my authentic self. That evening, I called my roommate from 3 years earlier, Maya, who was working with a female-led venture capital group in Los Angeles. "I have an idea," I told her, pacing around my tiny apartment near campus. "Solar-powered infrastructure kits for developing communities, plug-and-play systems that can provide clean energy and internet connectivity to remote areas." Maya listened intently as I outlined my vision. The technology already existed, but nobody had figured out how to make it accessible and affordable for communities that needed it most. I had been researching the concept for months, sketching out business models on napkins and staying up late, reading about microfinance and social impact investing. "You should pitch this to Viridian Capital," Maya suggested. "They're looking for exactly this kind of innovation." That conversation changed everything. Within a week, I had quietly withdrawn from Stanford and moved to a cramped co-working space in Venice Beach. My parents thought I was taking a temporary leave of absence to find myself, and I let them believe it. Chase called occasionally to check in, but our conversations always felt stilted and careful, as if we were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. For 9 months, I lived off my savings and ate ramen noodles while perfecting my pitch. I submitted proposals to 17 different investment groups and received 17 rejections. Some were form letters, others were more personalized feedback about market viability and scalability concerns. Each rejection stung, but it also taught me something valuable about resilience and determination. My parents never asked about the specifics of my break from law school, and I never volunteered the information. The less they knew, the better. I was building something revolutionary, something that could actually change lives, but I knew they would never understand. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Tuesday in March, exactly 9 months after I had started this journey. I was sitting in the cramped Venice Beach co-working space, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it. "Brielle Hampton? This is Jessica Chen from Viridian Capital. We'd like to schedule a meeting about your SunNest Systems proposal." My hands started shaking as I processed her words. Viridian Capital was one of the most respected social impact investment firms on the West Coast, led by women who had made their fortunes in tech and were now dedicated to funding companies that could create positive change. I had submitted my proposal to them 4 months earlier, and assumed it had been lost in the shuffle when I never heard back. The meeting took place the following week in their sleek downtown Los Angeles office. I wore my only professional suit and carried a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandfather. The conference room overlooked the city skyline, and I tried not to let the intimidating setting shake my confidence as I set up my presentation. Jessica introduced me to the other partners, Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian-born engineer who had revolutionized water purification technology, and Lisa Brennan, a former Goldman Sachs executive who had left Wall Street to focus on sustainable investing. These were women who had broken barriers and created their own paths, and I felt a spark of hope that maybe they would understand my vision. I presented my solar infrastructure concept with passionate precision, explaining how modular energy systems could be deployed in rural communities across Africa and South America. The technology wasn't just about providing electricity. It was about creating connectivity, enabling education, and empowering local economies. Each kit would include solar panels, battery storage, LED lighting, and satellite internet capability, all packaged in a weatherproof unit that could be assembled by local technicians. "The market research shows massive demand," I explained, clicking through slides that demonstrated the scope of energy poverty worldwide. 2 billion people still lack access to reliable electricity, and traditional grid infrastructure is prohibitively expensive for remote communities. "Dr. Chu," Okafor leaned forward, clearly engaged. "What's your scalability model? How do you plan to manufacture and distribute these systems affordably?" I had anticipated this question and spent weeks developing partnerships with manufacturers in Southeast Asia who specialized in renewable energy components. The key was creating standardized modules that could be produced efficiently while maintaining quality standards. "We partner with established manufacturers and focus on assembly and deployment," I replied. "Our value proposition isn't in reinventing solar technology. It's in making it accessible and sustainable for communities that need it most." The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I could see genuine excitement in their eyes. Jessica walked me to the elevator, and her parting words gave me hope. "We'll be in touch soon. This is exactly the kind of innovation we're looking for." That evening, I called Maya to share the news, but I didn't tell my family. They still thought I was taking a temporary break from law school. The call from Viridian Capital came 3 weeks later, and it changed everything. Jessica's voice was warm but professional as she delivered the news that would transform my life. Brielle, we'd like to offer Sunnest Systems $30 million in Series A funding, with an additional commitment for Series B if you hit your first-year deployment targets. I nearly dropped the phone. $30 million. It was more money than I had ever imagined, enough to launch operations across 3 continents and establish the manufacturing partnerships we needed to scale rapidly. The terms were generous, too. Viridian would take a 40% stake in the company, leaving me with controlling interest and the freedom to operate according to my vision. There's one condition, Jessica continued. We want you to accept a position on the California Renewable Council. It's a state advisory board that evaluates green energy initiatives and distributes federal grants. Your expertise would be valuable, and it would give Sunnest Systems additional credibility in the market. The California Renewable Council was prestigious, composed of leading experts in sustainable technology and environmental policy. Membership was by invitation only, typically reserved for executives with decades of experience. At 28, I would be one of the youngest appointees in the council's history. I'm honored, I replied, still processing the magnitude of what was happening. When would I start? Immediately. We're announcing the funding next month, and the council appointment will be part of the press release. This is going to put you on the map in a big way, Brielle. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence in my tiny Venice Beach apartment. 9 months ago, I had been a dropout law student eating ramen noodles and questioning every decision I had made. Now, I was about to become the chief strategy officer of a $30 million company, with operations spanning multiple continents. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, media interviews, and strategic planning sessions. Viridian's team helped me establish a proper corporate structure, hire key personnel, and begin the process of setting up manufacturing partnerships. I moved out of my cramped apartment and into a modern loft in Santa Monica, finally able to afford furniture that didn't come from thrift stores. The press coverage was overwhelming. TechCrunch featured Sunnest Systems as one of the top social impact startups to watch, and Forbes included me in their 30 under 30 list for social entrepreneurship. The attention was gratifying but also surreal. I kept expecting someone to tap me on the shoulder and tell me there had been a mistake. Through it all, my family remained oblivious to my success. I had perfected the art of deflecting their questions about my plans, giving vague answers about exploring opportunities, and taking time to figure things out. My father had stopped asking altogether after our last uncomfortable phone conversation, when he had again suggested I consider returning to law school before it was too late. Chase called occasionally, but our conversations felt increasingly distant. He was busy with a high-profile divorce case that was generating significant media attention for Hampton and Associates, and I could tell he was frustrated by my apparent lack of direction. In his mind, I was wasting my potential while he was building his career and contributing to the family legacy. "Dad's really worried about you," he said during one of our rare phone calls. "He thinks you're having some kind of quarter-life crisis." I almost laughed at the irony. While my father was worried about my supposed crisis, I was building something that would outlast his law firm by decades. But I kept that knowledge to myself, knowing that the revelation would be sweeter if it came as a complete surprise. The California Renewable Council position was officially announced in October, generating another wave of media coverage. My appointment was noted in several legal publications, including the California Bar Journal. But I didn't think my family paid attention to environmental news. The gap between my public success and my family's perception of my failure was growing wider every day. As Thanksgiving approached, the tension between my two worlds became almost unbearable. In the business world, I was being recognized as an innovative leader in sustainable technology. Sunnest Systems had deployed our first pilot programs in Kenya and Guatemala, providing clean energy to over 5,000 people in remote communities. The success stories were pouring in. Children studying by LED light Instead of dangerous kerosene lamps, small businesses operating refrigeration units for the first time, and community centers offering internet access for education and communication. But to my family, I was still the disappointing daughter who had thrown away her legal career for undefined pursuits. The disconnect was painful, especially when I received updates about Hampton and Associates' continued growth and success. My father had recently been honored by the San Diego Bar Association for his contributions to family law, and Chase was being considered for partnership ahead of schedule. I found myself caught between the desire to share my achievements and the strategic value of maintaining my secret. Part of me wanted to prove to my father that I had made the right choice, that dropping out of law school had led to something far more meaningful than partnership in his firm. But another part of me recognized that the element of surprise would be more powerful than gradual revelation. The week before Thanksgiving, I made a decision that would change everything. I purchased a $7 million oceanfront mansion in Malibu, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean and a private beach access. The house was a symbol of my success, but more importantly, it was a statement of independence. I was no longer the lost daughter living on borrowed time and good intentions. The real estate transaction generated its own media attention, as celebrity news outlets speculated about the young tech executive who had purchased one of Malibu's most exclusive properties. The attention made me nervous, but I assumed my family was too focused on their own concerns to notice entertainment news about property purchases. I spent the days leading up to Thanksgiving carefully preparing for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. My family expected me to announce my plans for returning to law school, or at least acknowledge that my experimental phase had failed. Instead, I was going to tell them the truth about my withdrawal and let them draw their own conclusions about my current situation. The morning of Thanksgiving, I drove from Malibu to my parents' house in La Jolla, taking the scenic coastal route that had always calmed my nerves. The familiar neighborhoods looked different now that I was viewing them from a position of financial success rather than dependence. I parked outside the house where I had grown up, noting how modest it seemed compared to my new Malibu estate. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual mixture of affection and concern. "Brielle, you look wonderful. How are you feeling about everything?" Everything was her diplomatic way of referring to my extended absence from law school without acknowledging the growing elephant in the room. I hugged her and followed her into the kitchen, where the familiar sounds and smells of Thanksgiving preparation transported me back to childhood memories of family gatherings that had felt warmer and more genuine. Chase arrived with his girlfriend Kelly, a fellow attorney who worked at a competing firm. They made the perfect legal power couple, discussing recent cases and bar association politics with the easy confidence of people who had never questioned their career paths. Kelly had always been polite to me, but I could sense her confusion about my current status as the family disappointment. As we gathered around the dining room table, I knew this would be the last Thanksgiving where my family saw me as a failure. The conversation I had been dreading began innocently enough, as family conversations often do. We had finished the main course, and my mother was clearing plates while my father poured wine with the ceremonial precision he brought to everything. Chase and Kelly were discussing a recent Supreme Court decision that could impact family law practices, and I found myself genuinely interested in their analysis despite my own divergent path. "Brielle," my father said suddenly, turning his attention to me with the focused intensity that had intimidated me since childhood. "I've been patient about this whole sabbatical situation, but we need to talk about your plans. Spring semester starts in 2 months, and if you're going to re-enroll at Stanford, we need to handle the paperwork soon." The assumption in his voice was clear. Of course I would be returning to law school, because what other reasonable option could there be? My mother nodded encouragingly from the kitchen doorway, clearly hoping this conversation would resolve the uncertainty that had been hanging over our family gatherings. "Actually, Dad," I said, setting down my wine glass carefully, "I'm not taking a sabbatical. I officially withdrew from Stanford 8 months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Kelly stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with Chase, and I could see my mother's face pale as she processed what I had just said. My father's expression shifted from confusion to anger so quickly that I almost flinched. "You what?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I withdrew from law school," I repeated, meeting his gaze directly. "I realized it wasn't the right path for me, so I left to pursue something else." Chase leaned forward, clearly trying to mediate before the situation exploded. "Brielle, maybe we can discuss options for reapplying next year. There are other good law schools that might—" "You don't understand," I interrupted. "I'm not planning to return to law school ever. I've started a company, and it's been incredibly successful." My father's face was turning red, and I could see the vein in his temple that always appeared when he was truly angry. "A company? What kind of company? Some little internet startup that will be bankrupt in 6 months?" "Sun Nest Systems," I said simply. "We develop solar-powered infrastructure for developing communities. We just closed $30 million in Series A funding." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I watched my family's faces as they tried to process what I had just told them. $30 million was more money than Hampton and Associates had generated in revenue over its entire 30-year history. "That's impossible," my father said flatly. "You've been out of school for 8 months. Nobody raises that kind of money without experience or credentials." "I have both," I replied calmly. "I spent 2 years developing the technology and business model while I was supposedly studying contracts and torts. And as of last month, I was appointed to the California Renewable Council." Kelly's eyes widened with recognition. "The Renewable Council? That's incredibly prestigious. My firm has tried to get clients appointed to that board for years." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. "You're lying," he said, his voice filled with a combination of rage and disbelief. "This is some elaborate fantasy you've constructed to justify throwing away your education." "I'm not lying," I said, remaining seated while he towered over me. "But clearly you'd rather believe that I'm delusional than accept that I've succeeded without following your plan." That's when he exploded with the words that would end our relationship forever. The next morning, I drove straight from my parents' house to my new Malibu mansion, my father's words still echoing in my ears. "Get out and stay out," had been his final statement before I walked out of their dining room for what I knew would be the last time. The 20-minute drive along the Pacific Coast Highway gave me time to process what had just happened and to plan my next steps. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left La Jolla, with missed calls from Chase and several text messages from my mother asking me to call them back. I ignored them all. The time for explanations and reconciliation had passed the moment my father chose to believe his own assumptions, rather than listen to the truth about my success. The moving truck arrived at noon, carrying the minimal belongings I had accumulated during my years of struggling to build Sun Nest Systems. Everything fit easily into 2 rooms of my sprawling new home, a stark reminder of how dramatically my circumstances had changed. As I unpacked my laptop and the framed photo of my first solar installation in Kenya, I felt a mixture of sadness and liberation that surprised me with its intensity. That afternoon, I called Jessica at Viridian Capital to discuss the timeline for our expansion into Central America. The conversation was energizing, focusing on concrete plans for deploying our technology to communities that desperately needed reliable energy access. As we talked about manufacturing partnerships and government approvals, I realized how much more fulfilling this work was than any legal career could have been. By the way, Jessica mentioned near the end of our call, we're getting some interesting inquiries about potential partnerships. Several law firms are reaching out about pro bono opportunities to support our community development work. "Really?" I said, suddenly interested. "What kind of firms?" "Mostly environmental law specialists, but a few family practices too. There's apparently significant interest in the corporate social responsibility angle." I made a mental note to review those partnership proposals carefully. The irony of law firms wanting to associate with my success wasn't lost on me, especially considering my father's complete dismissal of my achievements just hours earlier. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I was reviewing grant applications in my home office when my assistant called with an urgent update. "Brielle, I thought you should know that Hampton and Associates submitted an application for the State Renewable Energy Grant Program. They're requesting $2 million for a sustainability initiative. I almost laughed out loud. Hampton and Associates had never shown any interest in environmental issues during my entire childhood. The fact that they were suddenly pursuing green energy grants seemed like a transparent attempt to capitalize on the growing market for sustainable legal services. "What's the nature of their application?" I asked, pulling up the California Renewable Council database on my computer. "They're proposing to establish a pro bono legal clinic focused on environmental justice issues. The grant would fund 3 years of operations, including staff salaries and community outreach programs. As a council member, I had access to review all grant applications before they were evaluated by the full committee. I opened Hampton and Associates' submission and read through it carefully, noting the ambitious goals and impressive-sounding initiatives. The proposal was well-written and professionally presented, exactly what I would have expected from my father's firm. But there was one critical problem that the other council members wouldn't immediately recognize. Hampton and Associates had no experience in environmental law, no existing relationships with environmental justice organizations, and no track record of supporting sustainable initiatives. The application was essentially a request for $2 million to enter a field they had never shown interest in pursuing. More importantly, there was a clear conflict of interest that would disqualify their application automatically. I scrolled to the bottom of the council database entry and found the field I was looking for. Potential conflicts. I typed carefully, knowing that my words would determine the fate of my father's grant application. Sunnest Systems Executive Relationship, I wrote, adding my name and title for clarity. The rejection would be swift and public, visible to everyone in San Diego's legal community. As I submitted the conflict notice that would deny my father's grant application, I realized that revenge had found me rather than the other way around. The path I had chosen for authentic reasons had led to a moment of perfect justice that no amount of planning could have orchestrated better. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living successfully according to your own values and letting the consequences reveal themselves naturally.